Hey there folks, welcome to Spectrum Pulse. We talk about music, movies, art, and culture. And today we're going to be talking about the debut album from the Glorious Sons, titled The Union. So let's return to Canadian music scene for a bit. Now, as I mentioned in the past, I now live in Toronto, which is one of the major hubs of indie rock in Canada, mostly thanks to a thriving alternative community down here and multiple universities in the downtown core, so they've always got an audience. And what's even better is that said indie rock scene and those who get invested in it, like me, tend to have a fairly tight-knit community, to the point where if you know the right people, buzz tends to circulate fairly quickly about some bands. Now, it also means that buzz tends to die out fairly quickly if the word does not get out, which can be the death knell of indie acts. Even in the age of the internet, that still happens if your buzz dies. So when I start getting requests from Canadian bands, not just from you guys, but from friends who are actively involved in the Canadian indie music community, it means one of two things. Is that the buzz have reached some form of critical mass and we're looking at a possible radio or even a mainstream breakthrough, or I've got something really special on my hands. And when requests started coming in from the debut album of the Glorious Sons, after a very well-received EP, Shapeless Art, last year, that was described as blending the sounds of 90s hook-driven alt-rock and pub-friendly indie rock in today's day and age, it definitely caught my interest. So I made sure to buy their debut album, The Union, when it dropped, and I gave it plenty of listens. So, how is it? Well, it was not what I was expecting, that's for damn sure. With The Union, the Glorious Sons have done something really quite fascinating. A record that feels distinctly out of its own time. A 70s or 90s roots rock inspired album that owes debts to the tragically hip and Springsteen bringing a hard-edged blue-collar flavor. And yet with the production and especially with the self-aware lyrics, it's an album that feels still defiantly modern, lodged in modern indie rock traditions, with many of the album's themes exploring that disconnect between the music they're making and the time in which they're making it. And while I won't say that this album is great or works all the way through, it definitely gets close, but just not all the way through. I will say that it's a damn interesting listen, especially if you're the sort of guy who's been looking for a man's rock album of the year, and mainstream country or rock or hip-hop haven't exactly delivered. And look, I know, as ridiculous as it sounds for me to be saying that sort of thing in 2014, that's really the feel I get when I'm listening to this album. An album lyrically and instrumentally drenched in blue-collar, rough-edged Americana that seems firmly lodged in the masculine spirits that used to define country and rock music in the 70s and the 90s. Or, to put it another way, there's a fight song on this album with the lead-off single, Heavy, a bruiser of a track stained with beer and heavy riffs, with lead singer Brett Emmons bringing a gritty, grunge-inspired howl for his vocals that I really liked. And when this album sticks to that heavy, grimy formula, it can make some pretty damn impressive tracks. Now, Heavy, that was an early standout, but The Contender also stands up pretty damn effectively, calling back to the classic film On the Waterfront that was later referenced in the Scorsese film Raging Bull, and hammering on the boxing motif pretty effectively. I mean, when was the last time you had a good boxing song on an album? And there are plenty of moments across this record that let some of that textured heaviness really shine through. The creaking heft of Man Made Man, the washed out keyboards providing a really great contrast to the guitar melodies on Lightning, the heavy strumming on the more acoustic track Gordy, and even the ragged strings against the really great piano melody on Amigo. Now, if I were to have a few issues with the production on this album, it'd come down to the bass and the drum placement. While I definitely appreciate the heavy melodic focus on the guitars that you don't see enough in modern indie rock, the bass could have afforded a little bit more texture and came across as a little bit leaden on the bass solo on Mama, one of the two carryovers from their debut EP, Shapeless Art. But while the bass could have used a little bit more presence and texture, the drums probably could have used a little bit less volume, particularly in the cymbals and the snare drums, which came across as very dominant in the mid-range on a couple tracks. Now, I know that's a pretty minor issue, but it contributed to the real cleanness of some of the sound in the production that took away from some of the rough texture that I did like on this album that I wanted to see more of. Now, this takes us to the vocals, and let me stress that I really did like Brett Emmons' vocals, ragged enough to invoke images of grunge and alt-rock, but clean enough to match the production pretty well, all things considered. But I can't exactly say the same for the backing vocals. Now, don't get me wrong, I don't normally mind the male chorus if it's the grimy pub vibe that fits the Glorious Sons sound so well, but I'm not as much of a fan of the lighter backing vocals that came through on tracks like Man Made Man. Now, don't get me wrong, I get why they were included given given some of the band's influences and the band's feel from being from a different time, and yet very simultaneously very modern, and that sort of backing chorus is popular now in indie rock. But they were just another element that took away from that real rugged, grimy, heavy feel that was such a great fit for the band across most of the rest of this record. So you know what, let's talk about that concept that I found so interesting with this album, which takes us to lyrics and themes. Now it's immediately apparent that there was definitely a songwriting upgrade that took place between Shapeless Art and The Union, mostly in terms of lyrical nuance and sketching a more complete picture, which ultimately means that the two carryovers, White Noise and Mama on this album, they ultimately didn't feel as well written. And that picture that they're trying to sketch is of a ragged, macho group, toughing through hard times and trying to maintain that spark of life in their eyes in a very much a changing world. And what I really like about this album is that they don't hesitate to draw attention to how their icons have changed and evolved. Like on the track Gordy, that references both Clint Eastwood and Guns N' Roses, to say nothing of the Tragically Hip, who the main singer is referenced on the song, and their own personal struggle with machismo, which is well framed enough to show real struggle and insecurity. Hard Times, for instance, it's got this spoken word monologue at the back half of the track that shows real fear and is stepping something new, which honestly is a very real sentiment, even when that new thing could be measurably better. It's not comfortable, it's very new. The album closer Amigo touches on this as well, that shapeless frustration that comes from being stuck, when in a simpler time, that sort of insecurity would never have been an issue. You just had your place and you stuck with it. The reality is that life is more complicated now. And while there is a longing for simpler times with more defined roles, you can tell that the Glorious Sons know that there are still things, modern things, to strive for. And on the album's standout track Lightning, they hammer down on that point to great effect, saying that there are still things it could be darker elsewhere. But here's the odd thing on this album. Being an album stuck between the past and the present, it creates the odd problem that where songs emulating that past without some of the same nuance can be a little bit hit or miss. Now sure, Heavy and The Contender, they're solid enough, being pretty simple songs all things considered, but the title track features the chorus, I never joined the Union cause I never wanted it easy, and sure, I get the sentiment and ties back to that masculine individualism of the album's influences, the road warrior ideals that sparked the Clint Eastwood references, but at the same time, the bridge features a lyric about how the girlfriend's father doesn't like him because he's a dirty rock and roller. And again, while I know that this album is self-aware to realize exactly why the father doesn't like him, because he's a dirty rock and roller, doesn't join the Union, can't provide that sort of security, the framing of the song with the sing-along chorus does a lot more to glorify that old rock and roller aesthetic than it really should, given the rest of the album. Similarly, we've got the song Lover Under Fire, which is basically a track where the narrator tells his girlfriend to stop pestering him and just trust him because he really does love her. So much so that he'll be there when she's on her deathbed and will set her corpse on fire when she dies. Now honestly, that strikes me as a little bit melodramatic, just like the lyric on Mama, and I've never met a woman I've loved that I don't loathe. And okay, sure, I get the old-fashioned blues sentiment that informs the song, but I do wish some of the lyrical nuance that had informed other parts of this album and provided a little bit more nuance had carried over some of these tracks. But that's honestly the risk you run when trying to emulate the past, even with some degree of self-awareness. It's hard to have nuance and still maintain the visceral, emotional punch that comes with having that straightforward edge that calls back to a more simpler time. That's why the best moments on this album are informed by both, but sometimes you don't always get that. In other words, I do like The Union by the Glorious Sons. It calls back to an era of rock music that I like and does so well enough to create some really catchy melodies and some solid self-aware nuance to boot. I still do think that it's a little bit too clean and polished for my taste, and maintaining that balance they have between past and present can lead to a few slip-ups, but overall this record, it's got a lot of punch and it gets a solid 7 out of 10 from me. If you're looking for some guitar-driven rock with a hint of roots or alternative edge that's got an old-fashioned flavor but smart enough to keep it grounded in modern times, definitely give The Union by the Glorious Sons a look. You will not regret it. So yeah, thanks a lot for watching. If you'd like to like and subscribe, I'd be more than grateful. Any other albums coming out that you want me to take a look at, or if there's anything else I may be able to do to improve my presentation, I'm all ears. Until then, I'm Mark, you're watching Spectrum Pulse, and I'll see you next time.